right. Hello, everybody. And thank you for joining the first workshop on the climate vulnerability metric being developed by the Climate Impact Lab in partnership with MLab at UC Santa Barbara. We're glad that you all could join us here today. My name is Trevor Hauser, and I'm a partner at the Rhodium Group and co-direct the Climate Impact Lab. Before I start, I want to thank Tia Cordell and the team at MLab for organizing this event, and thank you all for taking the time on Tuesday afternoon to join us. As the climate changes around us, policymakers and the public are increasingly interested in understanding what those changes mean for human beings. And that is a question that the Climate Impact Lab was set up to answer now almost 6 years ago. By combining climate scientists and economists and data engineers on one team, we seek to produce evidence-based estimates of the impact of climate change on our health, on the communities we live in, and in the economy in which we operate. And we do that both to produce estimates of the social cost of carbon that can be used in developing policy to reduce emissions at the state level, the federal level, and around the world, as well as to provide information to decision makers to help make communities more resilient to those changes in the climate that are already occurring. One of the core insights in this research is that the costs of climate change are unequally spread, both within the US and around the world, and how important it is for policymakers to factor that inequality of impact into their decision making. And so it's with great pleasure that we embarked on this partnership with MLab to leverage the research that the Climate Impact Lab and others have been doing to develop a first of its kind climate vulnerability metric for the state of California, and in the process, develop an approach that we believe has the potential to scale nationally. And there's really no one better to lead that research in this project than Dr. Tama Carlton, who is a professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara Bren School, and is one of the leaders of the Climate Impact Lab's research. Before I hand it over to Tama, wanted to note that we are holding this workshop early in our process to be able to get input and feedback. As Tia will say, when we get to Q&A, there's a lot of participants on this call, including a number from outside California who are interested in how this research can be expanded. We're going to prioritize the discussion to stakeholders within the state of California, as that's the immediate focus of this research. With that, let me hand it over to Tama.
Great, thanks so much, Trevor. Thanks everybody for showing up. I'm really excited to talk through this project with you all. So I'm going to get a bit more into the details of our project, its scope, how we see it fitting in with the existing climate change assessments that we have in the state of California and across the US, and then talk a bit about next steps going forward. As Trevor mentioned, we're in the beginning stages of this process, and so we're really looking for input and feedback as we move forward. So in terms of an overview of our project, we are motivated by the evidence that is now undeniable that California's climate is changing. Just a couple examples of these that I'm sure people are familiar with. We look across the state of California, our temperatures today have warmed about 1 degree Fahrenheit over temperatures recorded in the beginning of the 20th century. But what you can see in this map on the left is that there are regions of California that have warmed up to and beyond 2 degrees Fahrenheit since that period. As another example, we're also facing increased flood risk. This is coming about due to rising sea levels, changing precipitation patterns, and it means that more of our housing stock are exposed to floods when we compare that to historical evidence and to existing federal level flood maps. And so while we know a lot about these changing physical hazards, these are a couple. We all know about wildfire risk and changing extreme precipitation, et cetera. We know a lot about these changing physical hazards, but a lot less about what they actually mean for daily lives and how they impact human welfare. So just a few examples of these, how does an extreme heat wave affect health outcomes, particularly for children and the elderly who we know are most vulnerable? How do extreme precipitation events affect our coastal infrastructure as we try to get to and from work living along the coast of California? And then what are the household level economic effects of this warming climate? How is my energy bill going to change as the temperature warms? And so it's really important here is to think about how we can translate those physical hazards that we know are changing into actual impacts that affect our daily lives in economic and in other terms. Of course, there are existing frameworks for doing this, both at the state level and at the federal level, but there are a few key gaps that we are hoping to fill with this project that don't exist in current frameworks. So let's think, for example, about the EPA's current estimates coming from the 2021 report on climate change and social vulnerability, and we'll sort of walk through their process and think about where we think we can step in and provide some improvements. So this approach involves two key steps. First, researchers estimate the impact of climate change on human welfare, critically assuming that all populations are uniformly vulnerable to a given physical hazard. So for example, on an extremely hot day, this assumes that me sitting in my office in a temperature controlled office is just as vulnerable in terms of my health risk to a worker who's sitting in the field exposed to that really hot day. So the first step is to estimate that impact, but assume that populations are sort of facing the average response and average vulnerability. But then the second step is to look at where socially vulnerable groups are located. So given this impact of climate change, are vulnerable groups more likely to live in places that are getting hotter days or more coastal flooding or more extreme precipitation events? And so this helps us begin to unpack differential vulnerability, but it misses recent climate economic research that shows us that physical hazards, of course, don't have the same effect on all communities and all individuals. This link between that physical hazard and actual human welfare on the ground is not uniform across different individuals. And so we really want to focus here on measuring that differential vulnerability in a data-driven way so that we can capture unequal effects of climate change that include the fact that populations are differentially able to respond. So to make that a little bit more concrete, we have three sort of overarching goals with this project. First, we just want to be able to quantify the most significant climate impacts that affect the daily lives of Californians. And then we want to take those impacts and turn them into what we call a climate vulnerability metric for the state that will achieve sort of three sub-goals. We want to assess what those impacts are on human welfare across different categories, for example, learning, health risk, energy, et cetera. And then we want to actually quantify impacts in the future. So what is the quantity of my increased death risk that I might face from an extreme temperature event? How will climate change in the future raise the magnitude of my energy statements, my energy bill? And then we want to turn these impacts into a single metric that can be used to compare impacts across communities. We really want to think about inequalities in those climate impacts across the state of California, really driven from our work, as Trevor mentioned, that shows that the burden of climate change in many different categories is very clearly unequally distributed across different populations. And then, of course, we're hoping that this is a metric that is useful both at the local level, state, and beyond. And so this, the data and the findings from this work will be made publicly available. So, of course, I just talked through this sort of federal level approach, but California has been a leader in so many ways on climate change, and this is no exception. So there are a wide array of climate change assessments for the state of California. These quantify key impacts like changes in mortality rates, changing energy costs, how much laborers are forced to work less because of extreme heat exposure, et cetera. But one key limitation is that the geographic granularity tends to be pretty limited. So the map that you're seeing on the right comes from California's 4th climate change assessment. And the most granular that we're going to get in this kind of assessment to date has been county level. And so I'm sure for all the Californians in the room, we know how different populations and communities can be within a given county. And we think that this is really insufficient for fully capturing differential effects of climate change within the state. And other policy experts have said the same and suggested that a census tract is a much more appropriate and scale of analysis so that we can really target and identify populations that are most vulnerable. So granularity is one area in which we are hoping to improve over and above existing assessments, but the other is really this key component of differential vulnerability. So existing tools, like we talked about at the EPA level, show us physical hazard projections at local level. How are extreme heat days likely to change? What does the wildfire risk look like going forward? And then overlay those physical hazards with key social vulnerability indicators. So for example, what proportion of my population is sitting below the poverty rate in this county? Or how many people in this county do not have health insurance? Some of these also think about key sort of components of adaptive capacity like air conditioning as well, but give us a sort of qualitative sense of where physical hazards are high and where vulnerable people live, but don't give us this sort of joint effect together of measuring who is most vulnerable and when. So there are sort of two ways here we want to improve on this. One is to actually provide quantitative estimates of what the impacts of future warming will be. So not just saying here's an increase in heat days and here are vulnerable populations living here, but can we quantify the increase in the mortality risk for that population in this location in 2050 under a given emissions scenario? So make that a real quantitative number. And then the second is to use data-driven estimates from historical data to quantify who is most vulnerable and where. So when we get that extreme heat day across a county within California, we want to account not just for where vulnerable populations are living, but bring data-driven estimates of how much more vulnerable each group is to that same physical hazard. So this sort of summarizes those last few points. We really want to focus on capturing differences across very diverse populations across the state, incorporating the fact that individuals and communities are very different in their capacity to respond to the same physical hazard. We want to provide this climate risk information at a very local level. In particular, we'll be focusing on the census tract as a unit of analysis to really isolate differential effects across neighborhoods and communities. And then the hope here with the data that we're trying to provide is to support targeted resiliency and adaptation. We know that these effects are going to be unequal, and by providing this type of information, we hope that we can help target resources to protect the most vulnerable populations by really finding who is most vulnerable in which categories of impact and when. So as we look forward to developing this metric, we have sort of three guiding principles that are structuring our work as we begin this process. And the first is to use historical data to account for the magnitude and the nature of the differences in vulnerability for different populations. So this approach takes sort of a couple steps. First, we estimate what's called a dose-response relationship. It sort of comes from the medical terminology, where you think about a dosage of a physical hazard and you measure the response that a population has to that physical hazard. And we use historical events to do this. So you can think about in the state of California, using historical evidence of what happens to agricultural workers when a drought event occurs, what happens to students in different learning environments when they're facing extreme days on test taking days, for example. And then we use high resolution climate models to project what might the future under climate change look like based on that evidence that we have from historical weather events. Critically, we do this in a way that accounts for differential vulnerability across groups. So to think about this in a concrete way, let's look at this graph that you have on the right. These are showing two different dose-response relationships, where the dosage on the x-axis is the daily maximum temperature that a population may experience. And on the y-axis, you're seeing how laborers are responding by lowering their labor supply, having to take off of work early or stop work because of those conditions. And we can see in the data that we find that it really matters what sector of employment you're working in, whether you are affected by this heat event. So if I'm sitting in my temperature controlled office, that very hot day may really not have much of effect on my productivity or my ability to do my job. In contrast, for workers that are in agriculture, mining, forestry, et cetera, that are facing those extreme conditions, that same physical hazard, that same hot day can have a really damaging effect on their amount that they can work. And so if we ignore this differential vulnerability that you can see here between like the blue line and the orange line, we can really miss important differences across populations in their exposure to and ultimately the impact of the same physical hazard. As another example of what this looks like, here's some of our previous work on the death rate and mortality risk impacts of climate change at county level across the United States using a similar type of methodology. And so you can see that climate change projected by 2050 under a moderate emission scenario has really different implications across the United States. And these differences are driven not just by the fact that the South gets more hot days than the North, but also because we find that key demographics and economic indicators have really important influences on how vulnerable each community is to that same event. In particular, we find in this work that low-income populations have a much harder time responding to the same heat event than high-income populations. And if we don't account for that differential vulnerability, this map can look really different and can miss really important dimensions of inequality. So this counting for these different responses is one of the key principles of our work going forward. The second is that we want to use climate data and climate impact relationships that capture the actual daily experiences that people face. So when I say, temperatures have warmed across the state of California by about 2 degrees Fahrenheit, that abstract number of 2 degrees Fahrenheit, that's not what is affecting our daily lives. What's actually affecting our lives are the number of heat waves that we get, the precipitation patterns that we're experiencing, the number of wildfires that come close to our homes. So we are careful to collect climate data that really reflects those daily events at the daily scale and at the local level. So both high spatial and temporal resolution in order to capture the events that people are really experiencing. When we go forward into generating climate change projections of the future, we're also careful to capture the full distribution of possible futures. So if there are low probability but very high risk events like large magnitudes of warming that could possibly occur, we want to generate projections that capture that full distribution, so we make sure to represent all possible futures under a warming climate. And then our last guiding principle here is that we want to report these estimates in a geographically granular way that are comprehensive across the entire state. So again, this can be useful for decision making at a variety of different scales. So given the sort of landscape of some of the existing assessments, we really hope that this can augment existing resources, both on the climate change in the climate change dimension, but also things like Cal EnviroScreen that are focused on pollution and other measures. And you're seeing one example of some very preliminary estimates here on the right, showing estimated impacts of climate change on labor supply in 2050 under a moderate emission scenario, where those darker red colors indicate more minutes that workers have to take off of work per day projected under 2050 relative to today. And so you can see really large diversity across the census tracts in California. And these estimates are built from this historical climate data that's combined with socioeconomic outcomes to identify the effect of specific daily events on outcomes like minutes per worker per day or across the state. And they come from those dose response relationships that you just saw that importantly accounts for differential vulnerability across groups. And we do this in a data-driven way where we're looking at the historical evidence on how different groups have been able to respond in order to inform these projections of the future that you're seeing in the map. So as we move forward, we're sort of just pulling the pieces of this project together. So the first step moving forward is to do a comprehensive review of the climate economics literature, where we're looking for important categories of impact across the state, where we have the evidence base to allow us to quantify these effects at the census tract level, and importantly, capture those differences in adaptive capacity and resilience across high resolution measures of different communities. We then want to take these impact categories. So I just showed you labor supply as an example, energy use, learning. There's a variety of different impacts that we may include based on that first step. We want to then develop a method to combine these across categories in order to develop this single climate vulnerability metric. We then will generate this using a given emission scenario. So identifying the most likely emission scenario and sort of the appropriate time period for projecting these climate change impacts into the future. And then of course, continuing to collect public comments on our methodology and the data inputs that we're using as we move forward. So I think with that, that's sort of my overview, and I'm definitely looking forward to questions and to having my colleagues join me up here for some Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Tama. Great presentation. We're now going to transition to the Q&A session here, where you all will have a chance to ask questions about the project, about the research, to our three panelists, Tama Carlton, Emily Wimberger, and Kelly McCusker. So you've already been acquainted with Tama, of course, so I will invite Emily and Kelly to introduce themselves, and then I'll go through instructions for how to submit questions and how the Q&A will work. So Emily and Kelly.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Tama, for a great presentation. I'm Kelly McCusker. I have a background in physical climate science, and I'm an associate director at Rhodium Group within the energy and climate practice. And I help to lead projects that seek to understand the localized impacts and costs of climate change around the world. And then also studying how to fold those impacts up into economy-wide estimates of the cost of climate change for use in policymaking. Happy to be here.
And hello, I'm Emily Wimberger. I'm a climate economist at Rhodium Group, and my work tends to focus on state level impacts, looking at federal policies and state policies, and really the macroeconomic impacts of varying policies in energy and climate. Prior to working at Rhodium Group, I worked at the Air Resources Board. I was the chief economist, so I'm very familiar with the ins and outs of California, and really excited to dive into this project and to get some feedback on our initial concepts.
Great. Thanks, Emily. Thanks, Kelly. And so instructions for the Q&A. So anybody can go ahead and think and submit your questions. And so to submit your question, please just click the Q&A icon at the bottom part of your screen. And then you can write your question in that box. You can either direct your question to a specific panelist, or you can share it just in general to the panel in general. If you would like to direct a question to a specific panelists, just indicated in that box. And so I'll read out the questions so the panelists will be able to answer. We also have a live notes doc that I believe Hannah just shared. So you can follow along and see our live record keeping of the questions that are asked and answered. And we're also recording this session. So we're just to be sure that we're capturing all of these conversations today. And so we're really excited to answer everyone's questions and for the interest generated both from within the state and from outside the state for this project. We will do our best to answer everyone's questions today, and we'll provide an email address at the end for everyone to share thoughts and questions that you might have after the session is all over as well. But because the study has direct implications for California communities, we'd like to prioritize hearing questions from folks who are doing work for and within California communities. And so we'll invite folks from outside the state to just hold questions for the first 5 or 10 minutes of this Q&A session to allow us to first answer questions from California residents. And then we'll be more than happy to open it up to everybody and to hear questions from everyone. Without further ado, I think we'll get going on the first couple of questions. And so the first question comes about, and it says, can you share more information about the methods for your dose response calculations?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. I see that Lena's based in Austin, but we're close by.
Oh, so sorry. Didn't read that.
Sure. So as Trevor mentioned at the top, this project is sort of born out of our work at the Climate Impact Lab, quantifying the impacts of climate change at global scale. And we leverage a set of tools in doing that have been used across the climate economics community. So the research that we'll be incorporating here is not just our own at Climate Impact Lab, but really thinking across this body of work that in the climate economic space. And the basic idea for how these dose response relationships are computed is to collect data from a given set of outcomes. So for example, say we're interested in mortality risk of temperatures. We'll collect historical data on mortality rates and historical climates, and then build a statistical model that investigates how mortality rates have changed when we've seen the temperature change in the past. And importantly, you can think about this statistical model basically building a treatment and control where we follow individual populations and we say, when this region in Central California had a slightly hotter summer than last year, how did the mortality risk change with that slightly warmer summer? And we use those variations in the climate within a given location to estimate how a given dosage of a temperature event influences the outcome of interest. And so that's sort of the basic layer of dose response calculations. Importantly, we account for differential vulnerability by additionally collecting a host of demographic and socioeconomic relationships to build into that statistical model. Well, when I see that that heat event occur in a lower income population versus a higher income population, does that same event in the data lead to a different effect on mortality rates? And for example, what we find in that work is yes, that lower income populations are much more vulnerable both to extreme cold and extreme heat than our higher income populations. But that type of model is used across these different outcome categories like energy and labor use and education, et cetera.
Great, thanks, Tama. I think we'll go to the next question, which is about the timeline for this project. Yeah, will one of you answer, what is the timeline for this project?
Emily or Hannah, do you want to give the overarching? I have the general sense of the overarching individual goals.
Well, I can speak to the timeline. So the timeline that this research is operating under is that the final report and data will be developed by the end of the year, so the end of 2022. And again, this is really sort of the start of what is an aggressive research agenda for the year of 2022. But there will be plenty of opportunities for feedback during the remainder of the research period as well.
Great, thanks, Emily. Great, we'll go to the next question. Are you aware of or collaborating with the Governor's Office of Planning and Research effort to develop a statewide vulnerable communities platform for mapping climate change vulnerability in California?
Yes, so I can take this one. We're definitely aware, and there's been a lot of really great work that's been done, as was mentioned, in the state of California and federally to really look at climate impacts and to really understand the impacts across different communities. So a lot of the work that has been done, as Tama pointed out, has really been at sort of a higher level, and it really hasn't had the granularity that we're really hoping to offer through this research project. We're very much aware of the existing work that is being done, the great work that's being done in California, and really are looking to all of these existing tools for data sources to be consistent, and then to sort of add the Climate Impact Lab FLAIR, which really is to look at these differential impacts. So the answer is yes, a very long yes.
Great. Okay, great. Maybe let's go to this one. Do you see this tool interfacing in some way with CalEnviroScreen, which we use to qualify communities to receive services per our state of California grants?
Yes, and this is, I mean, California has been leaders in this space and thinking about how to identify communities that should be prioritized that are facing the hardest impacts of environmental pollution and health impacts. So CalEnviroScreen has a great legacy in California. One thing that it does not include, though, are the impacts related to a warming temperature. So there are environmental impacts that are included in CalEnviroScreen, and one of the long-term hopes would be that the metric that's being developed through this research project could really augment CalEnviroScreen. It could be used in addition. So the goal would be that you could have a metric that would look, across climate, across air pollution, to really look at a more comprehensive impact of climate change and changing climate and air quality on communities in California.
Great. Awesome. Thanks, Emily. Okay. And whoops, I think one of them just disappeared, but I think I'll go back. Do you know how you will choose an emission scenario, or will you choose to use multiple? The fourth assessment uses RCP 4.5 and 8.5. Do you plan to do the same?
Yeah, thanks for the question. As we had on our next step slides, it's not something that we have decided on yet. I think it's really important obviously very important to choose an emission scenario. What that map I showed you for some preliminary results for labor chose an emission scenario. And of course, what these impacts will look like can be very different under different emission scenarios. The way that we've been thinking about it so far is because we're presenting this map of across the state of California aggregating impacts, and we're trying to simplify this into a single metric to try to choose a scenario that reflects the most likely future emissions trajectory. Of course, that's a difficult and a subjective decision to try to think through. But instead of sort of a scenario approach of many different possible futures, to try to hone in on one emission scenario that represents the most likely future to sort of simplify the output and give us this one single metric. So both of those, amongst others, will be considered, and we haven't sort of landed exactly on which one we'll use yet.
Thanks, Tama. And I'll provide an email address if folks have thoughts on those, to send in written input or thoughts about emission scenarios into our group as well, as we are continuing to make decisions on this project. I will kind of ask one of the questions that we've generated that we often get. How can this type of analysis be used to inform climate policy? And so this will be for Tama or Emily.
Yeah, I can start out and then Emily can bring all her policy expertise to bear on the question. But I think the idea here is really that as we face a warming climate, measures of differential vulnerability are incredibly important to help target resources where they matter most. So 1 to 2 degrees of warming across the state of California will have really different effects for different populations. And as we try to bring resources across the state at various different levels of government to help mitigate the inequalities of that warming climate, we need to have estimates that actually tell us who is most vulnerable when, under what emission scenario, and where. And so we hope that that this will really help in adaptation policy. And importantly, as Trevor mentioned, this is built out of our work on the social cost of carbon, which is really helping anchor on the mitigation side of the climate change problem. But as we are sitting here facing the warming climate unfolding around us, this is really helping us speak to and hopefully help target and improve adaptation policy by identifying who's most vulnerable across the state and hopefully beyond the state in the future.
I think the only thing I would add to that is just in a policy setting, all the impacts that Tama just outlined, we're seeing the impacts of those right now. And so the goal of this metric is really to understand, there's investments being made all across the country at the federal level, the state level, and the local level. And this metric will really help identify communities that should be prioritized because they're facing disproportionate impacts. And it can also help sort of direct sort of the type of mitigation, the type of resiliency that you want to see these communities build up. Because as we're not only looking at sort of the climate vulnerability of the community today, but we're also projecting that into the future. So we can think about long-term funding streams and really where we should be, the state, the federal government, and local agencies should be directing their funding.
Awesome. Thanks, Emily. Yeah, there's another question, and folks, feel free to share your questions as you think of them as well. So here's a question is, what is the highest level of spatial resolution you expect to have?
Oh, yeah, I can take this one. So we expect to be doing this at the census tract level, which is suggested to be a good geographic resolution that can capture the climate impact, the differential climate impacts to disadvantaged populations at the local level. And we will be able to use Census Bureau data on socioeconomics and population and things like that. So that's the highest level of resolution we'll be doing, we expect to do.
Great. Thanks, Kelly. Okay, so so sorry, I was trying to determine which question to ask. So here's another one. Is it possible to factor in the impacts of different changes to the cap and trade program?
I think this is a really interesting question. There's obviously a lot of important interactions between cap and trade, climate impacts in California, and pollution impacts in California. And I know there's a lot of changes on the horizon with the cap and trade program. I think what's really important to distinguish here is our scope as focused on the impacts of climate change and not the impacts of air pollution. So while the cap and trade program in California is targeting CO2 emissions, of course, there are lots of co-pollutants that come along with changes in greenhouse gas emissions that occur within the state of California, and those have very direct impacts on human health in particular through local air pollutants. The scope of our project is on climate change impacts themselves, not local air pollutants. And so because California's cap and trade, while it definitely is contributing to the scale of global climate change, because it's just cap emissions within the state of California, changes to that cap and trade program are not likely to influence the overall aggregate emissions that are coming into, for example, our decision of RCP 8.5 or 4.5. And so I think those impacts are incredibly important. And I think we all hope that those are incorporated into other assessments of vulnerability from environmental damage in California, including air pollution. But in terms of our scope, we're focused on climate change impacts. And so I don't think the cap and trade programs itself would be factored into the particular scope of this project.
And I think I would just add on to that. I think, there's sort of two pieces, well, there's many pieces to the cap and trade program, but a really important and significant piece to disadvantaged and frontline communities is really where the revenues from the cap and trade program are being directed. So I think there could be, this metric and being able to identify communities that are directly impacted from the emission from a warming planet, from carbon emissions, as Tama said. So I'm not looking at air pollution, but what are the impacts of a warming planet and carbon emissions on vulnerable communities? And so this could be something that could help in the future direct the proceeds and the revenues that are coming into the cap and trade program. So there could be some material impacts related to the revenue side, but just wanted to add that there.
Great, thanks, Tama. Thanks, Emily. I'm going to just share another one of the questions that you all get asked, which is, can you say more on how this research improves how the social cost of carbon is estimated?
Yeah, I can jump in there. And Kelly can as well. We both spend a lot of our time thinking about the social cost of carbon. So our work and a lot of the similar type of methodologies that I talked about here have been used to inform rapidly changing policy on the social cost of carbon right now. And there are a few areas that we've really been a part of innovating on the SCC front that are manifesting in this project as well. And the first is just bringing data to bear on this question. So we've all looked at these maps of changing physical hazards, but that relationship from a changing physical hazard to an actual impact on human welfare in the past, particularly at the global scale, when we're looking at estimates of the social cost of carbon, that link has been really far removed from actual empirical data. And when it has, it's largely relied on data from relatively temperate, wealthy regions of the world instead of fairly representing the global population. So a lot of the more innovative work on the SCC has brought data to bear on that question, and then also innovated on this differential vulnerability front. So if we are going to estimate the impacts of climate change at the global scale, if we ignore the large diversity in vulnerability and adaptive capacity between, for example, Mumbai and Chicago, Illinois, there's no way we're going to get the number right for the aggregate impacts of climate change across the globe. So a lot of the statistical innovation in that space has been to be able to use historical evidence to measure that differential vulnerability. And that's the same type of statistical approach and methodology that we are then applying within the state of California to assess these differences and the diversity within the state of California, same type of idea that's been applied at the global scale for the SCC.
Great. Oop, thanks, Tama. And sorry, there's a motorcycle outside right now, so you might hear some background noise, the joys of working from home. Okay, so the next question here is, how will communities themselves be involved in naming their vulnerabilities?
Sorry, I tried to unmute myself and took my video off. And so this is a really, really important question. And I think, the ultimate goal is really trying to understand with as much granularity and certainty as possible what the comprehensive impacts of air pollution and climate change are on communities. And so what we're really looking at here is, first of all, what are the impacts that can be quantified? So where, as Tam explained, where is there data? Where are there metrics that we can actually, we can sort of go from a 10,000 foot level and really understand the impacts at the local community level. So there needs to be sufficient data. And so what we've been doing in this really initial step in thinking about the research is really looking at everything that's out there. So all the literature that's been done in quantifying the impacts. And again, we're focused just on carbon emissions and a warming planet, so not air pollution, but really what are the impacts that people are seeing that, that have been demonstrable in communities across the globe, how then do those translate to impacts to California populations? We're not going to see the same impacts in California. California is a very diverse state and has lots of mountains, beaches, desert, but it's not exactly representative of the global view and the global impacts that we might see. So what are the impacts that are going to be material to California, and thinking about those that have the biggest impact. So as Tam was mentioning, sort of mortality and changes in energy costs, changes in health outcomes from a warming planet. So really trying to prioritize sort of the top level biggest impacts that both will impact California, and that data exists that you can actually quantify this and come up with a metric. And so we're definitely willing to, and this is sort of the point of this initial workshop, is really to get feedback on, are there things that we are missing? Is there data out there that we should be looking at? Are there specific researchers and people that we should be canvassing? Because we do want to do, to the extent we can and to the extent data exists, we want this research to really be as comprehensive as possible. So we're taking written comments, and we would love to hear if there are things that are really meaningful to communities that we should be including that maybe weren't on our initial list.
Great. Thanks, Emily. Okay, next one. How will rural versus non-metro communities / tracts be differentiated in terms of adaptation / policy / funding? Rural regions can be left out due to lower populations, etc.
I can take that, and others are always welcome to add, of course. I think this is a really important question, and I have a couple different answers. So one is, I think we've said this a few times, but we're really focused on gathering evidence that we have where we have comprehensive estimates of climate impacts across the state. So that means that if there's a study that only tells us something about downtown LA, we're only going to be focused on impacts that we can actually quantify across the state, so that we aren't weighting only towards things that have been studied, for example, in our urban areas. And then the other component to this answer is, I think you're raising really important questions about how we aggregate information across the state. And so this is something that Cal EnviroScreen has a method for, and other metrics have a method for. And I think we have a lot of open questions, and we're really looking for input in different ways that we can aggregate impacts and summarize these disparities across the state at tract level. So one example of a way that we can do this that hopefully mitigates your concern about lower populations would be to report climate change impacts in a per capita manner. So not necessarily the total magnitude of the impacts in a given location, but what are the impacts per person? What is the energy burden per household from increases in energy expenditure as air conditioning demands go up, for example? And so by taking approaches like that, where we measure per capita, we can avoid some of these challenges of non-comparability across different locations. But again, we're still building that metric, and definitely open to people's comments on the best ways to do that comparison across space.
I'll also just add to that, Tama, that the census tracts do vary quite a bit in their geographic size. And I think that's so that they can capture like a more similar population within them. So even if we do aggregate to census tract on a not per capita level, we're still going to be capturing populations that are fairly similar across all the geographies.
Great. Thanks, Emily. Thanks, Kelly. I'm going to go ahead with one of the questions that we've been asked, which is, how do you determine which climate impacts should be included in the climate vulnerability metric?
I can jump in again. There are a few different criteria. So I just mentioned this in the last answer, but we really want, or our thinking right now is that we want impacts that are available comprehensively across the entire state. We're really focused on disparities in impacts, and so we want to be able to fairly represent everyone for a given category of impact. We want to be able to use us to characterize things at a local level. So there may be estimates that give us one number of climate damages across the entire state for a given category, and that's nearly not helping us in the scope of this particular project. So we're focused on impacts that can be characterized at the census tract level. And then back to my points about differential vulnerability, not all existing estimates allow us to fully assess differential vulnerability across different communities. And so if there are estimates that ignore those differences across different groups, we're not looking to include those. We're hoping to include estimates that do account for differential resilience and adaptive capacity at the census tract level. Emily or Kelly may remind me if they're missing a key category for our criteria, but those are the ones that come to mind.
I think we also wanted to make sure that the impact captures daily climate conditions.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and this kind of ties into one of the other questions that's on the board, but capturing daily climate allows us to accurately characterize how the populations respond to local changes, because we don't live in an average climate. People respond on a daily basis to what their weather is. And so we do focus on impacts where we can characterize the relationship on a daily level.
Yeah, so maybe we'll just go to that question. The seasonality question, I think, is the one that you're referring to. Is seasonality considered in your models? For example, ag workers may reduce their work hours in hottest seasons. However, the work season may also change if the growing season changes. So yeah, maybe you could expand on kind of that theme to include seasonality.
Yeah, Tama, do you want to?
Yeah, I wasn't sure if you wanted to keep my either. Yeah, I think this is a great point that changing when economic or other activities take place is one really important potential dimension of adaptation. So we've seen this in some prior work, like you're mentioning on ag, but in other forms of labor productivity, where researchers will look for evidence that workers are able to shift when and how they work to adapt to that changing climate. And again, we can use historical evidence to see if this is feasible and in what industries it is feasible and where it's more difficult. So that's a great example of a dimension of adaptation or differential vulnerability that would be included as we build those dose response function estimates. And so with that example, I think it's a great example. And I think the answer would be, to the extent that that's been shown and measured in existing research, absolutely would be included, because we have daily climate data changing, when temperatures are impacting individuals based on when they're working, could absolutely be included if there's sufficient evidence in the research, in existing research, to inform that type of adaptation as we've observed it occurring in the past in California. Anecdotally, I know from some other industries, like we've been hopeful to see that type of adaptation, and it looks, my read on the existing literature is that it has been harder than we may expect to adjust on a lot of these margins. And so I think, we're taking a data-driven approach, and if we do see evidence that is happening, then absolutely that could be included in these projections.
Great. Okay, I'm going to go to the next question here. So will this metric allow a policymaker to easily tease back out specific risks that highly vulnerable communities face and needed resilience at investments, or would this metric need to be incorporated as a layer in other platforms like CalEnviroScreen?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And again, this is early stages of the research, but the goal is really to develop a comprehensive metric that can be used to inform policy and investment decisions when it comes to looking at populations and communities that are vulnerable based on sort of the climate impacts that we're outlining here. So the thought is that it could be used as a standalone metric, or it could be, as mentioned earlier, it could augment something like CalEnviroScreen, where it could then be sort of a more comprehensive metric of both the climate impacts and the environmental hazards that are faced by specific communities, given that we're trying to achieve the same level of granularity at the census tract.
Great. So we're at 10 minutes to the end. So I'm just going to remind everyone, please share your questions. We'll continue taking questions for about another 5 to 7 minutes to allow us to kind of close off and share next steps. So here, another question here. Sorry if I missed, oh, sorry, I shouldn't read that part, but are you quantifying impacts at workplaces, schools, and other settings within census tracts where disparate vulnerability occurs?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think, of course, in a world where we could observe things at really high resolution, we would like to be able to distinguish even events that happen within a census tract. I think if your question is about whether we can identify individual communities or households within a census tract, the answer is no. We're going to be focused on the census tract as our level of observation. But importantly, because we know a lot of aggregate demographic and socioeconomic information about that census tract, we can use things like what type of workplaces are in that census tract. Are there a lot of youth in the census tract based on schools in informing our estimates of differential vulnerability? So one example, we may not know exactly where construction sites are taking place within the census tract, but we have a measure of how many people in that tract are employed in construction or in agriculture or in mining. That information about the sector of employment can help inform differential vulnerability for the census tract. So the things that we know about what's happening within the census tract at that level in terms of who's there and what sectors of employment or other key socioeconomic conditions are taking place will be used to inform ultimate estimates of differential vulnerability. Back to you, Tia.
Great. Okay, so while folks are thinking of maybe their last questions here, I will just share one that I think we've already pretty much touched on, but a good way to kind of round it out and to summarize. How is this research different from the existing tools that are being used in California?
Yeah, I can jump in. I think probably repeating myself a little bit, but a few different dimensions. One is really granularity. So you guys have all been asking really great questions about the census tract level. I think there's a lot of reasons why that's a spatial scale that can be really valuable for measuring just diverse impacts across the state. So that's an improvement upon existing estimates that are only at the county level. The second is to actually quantify these impacts. So I showed you some maps earlier showing us generally where hot days might occur and where vulnerable populations live within the state, but turning that into a quantitative number of what the magnitude of the effects might be in a given time period, we think is really valuable. And then of course, quantifying this differential vulnerability in a data-driven way. So not sort of generally saying we think there's some epidemiological evidence that the elderly are more at risk from a heat wave, but instead using data-driven estimates of how much more vulnerable and on what dimensions of vulnerability do we see evidence that people are less able to cope. Those will be included in those estimates of dose response functions so that when you see a map, it's not just who's exposed to more hot days, but it's actually capturing the fact that populations can be very differentially able to respond to that hot day or that flooding event or that wildfire.
Great. Thanks, Tama. And I don't see any more questions coming up, so I think we might just close out and share what the next steps here are and how you can continue to follow up. So we'll continue taking further feedback, comments, questions via email for 1 week after today. So in other words, you can send us an email to the address on the screen here, and we will take in that input and answer questions until the end of the day on February 1st. And then, we'll have to cut it off. However, this project itself is ongoing. It's an iterative process and it's still under development, as we've said. And so there will be many additional opportunities for public comment as this project moves forward. And so we'll also be posting a recording of this presentation on the website, and we'll also share the presentation from today, the slides from today, as well as a written summary of the conversation via email to those who registered for the workshop today. And then whenever the report is completed down the road, we'll share that with you all as well. So great, thanks. Thanks to all who attended. Thank you, panelists, and thank you to everyone who helped put this together. And so we'll end this workshop just a couple minutes early. So yeah, have a great rest of your day. Thank you all.